It absolutely does not disappoint. John Wick 4, check it out. Ari Shaffir's Skeptic Tank. I hate to end the podcast on a sad note, but alas, it's not all unicorns and rainbows, folks. Ari Shaffir, my favorite comic and one of my favorite podcasters, has chosen, after 12, almost 13 years of putting out gem after gem after gem of episodes on his Skeptic Tank podcast, has chosen, at the height of its popularity, at the height of its financial benefit generating, at the height of its creativity and awesomeness, some may even say, has chosen to cancel it, to stop it, to end it, to put an end to an era. And if you all know Ari, as I do not, although I have been a fan of his for over that decade and did meet him once actually and have a picture with him, I'll probably use that image as when I put out clips of this episode. But if you all know Ari, none of those things in terms of financial gain and popularity and fame and stuff like that have ever been at the top of his priority list. He's first and foremost about his craft, which I've always appreciated about him, and about being free and feeling free, not feeling tied down to anything. So much so that in a situation like this, where most of us mere mortals would have been like, fuck that, I'm going to continue the podcast. It's making more money than it's ever made, and it's as popular as it's ever been, and I obviously love doing it. But because it began feeling to him somewhat of a job at times, and he felt it taken away from his true and number one love, which is stand-up comedy, he chose to cancel it, which you have to respect, but fucking sucks for us fans. Ari's been absolutely at the top of the list of my favorite podcasters, literally probably top 2 after Rogan. And fun fact, which I have mentioned in the past, I believe, but I'll reiterate here, the very first episode of JRE that I ever listened to, over a decade ago, before it was cool, when Ari was a relatively unknown comic, when even Rogan was relatively unknown outside of comedy circles. The very first episode that I ever listened to, Ari was the guest. It was like episode 190 something. And by one, I don't mean 1,000. I mean literally 190 something, or maybe it was even 90 something. But I think it was 190 something or 130 something, or something like that. For some reason, I remember there a 9 in there. And it was literally the second podcast of any that I had ever listened to before I even knew really what a podcast was. I had heard the term, and I was literally just searching on my phone, what is a podcast? And the first one ever that I listened to was the White House speech that was recorded and replayed in podcast form. It was the White House podcast or something like that. It was a speech that Obama gave. And then the second one I bumped into was JRE and that episode with Ari. And the conversation was so fulfilling, is the best way I can put it. It was, I had never heard people speak like that. So freely, so openly, so deeply, so silly. The conversation flowed and ebbed in all different forms and directions. And in that moment, I fell in love with the medium of podcasts. And since never missed an episode of JRE, became a fan of Ari's and started checking out his stuff, including Skeptic Tank podcast, became a fan of his stand-up, and he became my favorite comedian. In that way that you, like when you feel that you discovered someone, quote unquote, would know about something and someone cool that nobody else knows about yet. And Ari's podcast I love for a lot of those same reasons, in terms of his care and attention to detail for his craft. Now, the very last guest of Ari Shaffir's Skeptic Tank was Ron Bennington, which I believe, I don't think I'm wrong on this, but I can be, that Ron Bennington is the Ron from Ron and Fez, which was and I'm drawing this just from things that I've heard on different episodes of different podcasts. So again, could be wrong, but I don't think so. And Ron and Fez is a morning radio show that comics actually enjoy doing and respect. Because comics famously, as they travel from city to city, go on morning radio, morning TV to promote their dates and try to sell tickets within the region that they're in. But it's a grueling thing for them. But the consensus behind Ron and Fez is that, it's a dope show that they actually enjoy getting up for and doing. Ron Bennington, I believe, is the Ron from Ron and Fez. He has his own series of interviews, which I've only heard one, so I can't attest to what Ari says about him, just based off that one. But I did hear his interview with, it's called Unmasked, the series, and I listened to the interview with Patrice O'Neill, which both Ari and he recommended folks listen to, and it was great. But Ari gives his style of interviewing, his interview style, he says it's an homage to Ron Bennington. And my interview style is an homage to Ari Shaffir. That's how much I enjoy and loved Ari Shaffir's Skeptic Tank, and still do. Now, I primarily on this show, I do these solo episodes mainly, where I'll, deep dive and review and speak to the writing and, story conventions and structures of movies and books and TV shows, speak about some current events and just whatever the fuck I want to speak about, right? Get some thoughts and ideas out. I also do the free writing session episodes, which are more to craft, more specific to writing. I tell you about what I've been working on, how often I've been working on it, share writing tips, share some of my own writing, reflect on it, etc. But another iteration of episodes that come out here on the Spun Today podcast feed are interviews, which are far and few between. But when I do them, I do them in the style that I learned from Ari Shaffir, which again, he learned from Ron Bennington, or at least is paying homage to. And that's where he takes a deep dive into his guests and a specific topic. And he doesn't mind if it meanders and it goes off track and they get silly, or if they start talking about something deep, completely separate. They go off on tangents as well, but then he pulls it back on course to a specific topic. And he has a series of questions lined up aimed at that specific topic, and I just love that interview style. And they're not cookie cutter interviews by any stretch. They are, you hear from people that you otherwise, at least me, I've never heard of through any other medium or any other interview or any other, I have no insight into some of these folks' lives, and Ari asks questions that I didn't know that I had. So he's interviewed prostitutes, drug addicts, drug dealers, other comedians, of course, one of which, Brad Williams, for example, which is a little person. And he interviewed him all about being a little person and just had uber specific questions like, what do you do in the bathroom? Because little people are known, or at least some, that to have short arms. So he's like, what do you do in the bathroom when you take a shit? Like, he literally asked questions like that. And then Brad Williams says, oh, well, we actually have a contraption, like a arm extender thing that we use to help out there. That's something that I didn't even know existed, and a question that I didn't even know that I had. You know what I mean? But when he asks it, you're like, oh shit, yeah, it's true. How do they? He did also episodes with homeless people, with folks, travelers, with writers, with episodes all about the first time a girl got her period, and he interviewed a bunch of different women. Oh, one of my favorites are comedy special breakdowns, where he would go bit by bit with the comedian that filmed the special, and then they'll break down the behind the scenes of how that joke came to be, what the real story is behind the joke, what's exaggerated, what's not, which is a masterclass on comedy in and of itself, but just from a writing and creative perspective, I love that type of shit. He has episodes specific to open relationships and just so many fringe topics and people like that are just absolutely fucking fascinating. Fuck, I'm gonna miss that show. And he also put me on to so many people just through, when you take a deep dive into a person or an interest that a person has, it becomes contagious and you want to know more about that person in a way. And you get insights into that person as well, because it's long form, not edited, no fluff, no bullshit. And you get to know if someone's, at least in my opinion, interesting or not, or if they're kind of a piece of shit, or if you want to know more about the person, etc. So it's definitely been the source of a lot of people that he put me onto, that I wind up, just like listening to Rogan's podcast put me onto Ari, and I started listening to Ari's stuff and getting into his stuff, his podcast, his comedy. He also Ari put me on rather, in that same way, to folks like Dave Smith from the Part of the Problem podcast. He's a comic as well. If you want to know anything political and have a fairly nuanced, because he's very libertarian, nuanced in the sense of the traditional Republican versus Democrat view of things, you can definitely listen to his take on stuff. He's biased towards libertarians, obviously, but by definition, because he's a libertarian, he's you're going to get a more nuanced view of both the Republican and the Democratic side. He also put me on to Steve Simone, which good times with Steve Simone. And I've told him this on Instagram. I hope he brings that podcast back. That's a podcast that if you're ever in a bad mood, you just listen to an episode of that. And Steve is just like such a wholesome, fucking good person that just spends his time fucking doing stand-up comedy, like family-friendly stand-up comedy, and then volunteering the rest of his time at children's sick wards and hospitals and shit. His energy is just so pure and positive that you listen to that if you want to feel good, if you want to get in a good mood. Sadly, he stopped doing his podcast some time ago. I believe it was around COVID, and I heard through the podcast grapevine that both his parents got really ill, and they thought they were on their deathbed, and thankfully they were not, or at least I believe, and I hope is the case. But I hope he definitely continues to do his podcast again. And so many other folks like Fahim Anwar, Big J. Okerson, Dan Soder, Danish and O'Neill, Joe List, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Like, all these people, I first heard of them on Ari Shaffir Skeptic Tank, which was an absolute fucking treat. The fucking tastemaker, this guy. And in many ways, Ari ended the West Coast, East Coast beef, quote unquote beef. Because there was like I don't want to call it podcast wars or like an actual beef between comics, so East Coast versus West Coast comics, but there was unspoken divide, at least in my opinion. Palpable kind of, if there's allegiances, where everyone's allegiance lies. And Ari was a West Coast comic, comedy store comic, who moved to New York and kind of like bridged that gap and brought all those barriers down after that move, I feel, by bringing a lot of the East Coast folks onto his podcast, like the Big J's, and then introducing them to Rogan, and then them getting on Rogan, and in doing so, blowing up to the rest of the world and to the West Coast, and kind of just melding that comedic podcast world. But yeah, man, he chose after 12, 13 years. His first episode, according to what I'm looking at, came out, which was with Kurt Metzger, September 28th, 2011. Fun fact, the Spun Today podcast started September 29th, but 2014, 3 years later. But yeah, first episode, September 28th, 2011. Last episode, June 7th, 2023. What a fucking run. Round of applause for Ari Shaffir and the Ari Shaffir Skeptic Tank. Now, he did say that, one, he's not going away. He's still going to do everybody else's podcast. So I'm definitely happy for that, and to get his perspective that way. Although it won't be the same, obviously. But we also have this catalog of hundreds of episodes that we will hopefully always be able to go back and listen to at our leisure whenever we want, which I have and plan to continue doing so. Now, I did hear him say on, I believe it was Joe List's podcast, that he's contemplating just taking down the Skeptic Tank podcast altogether, like just removing it from the internet, which he definitely shouldn't do, because one, if it's on the internet already, which it is, all the episodes are, they'll always be, people will always repost and put them up, and it's just going to be a bitch for people to track down and find, I guess. But that he has a thought of doing so just to protect certain guests from future PC culture bullshit down the line. Because he's, 5 years from now, who the fuck knows what people are going to be upset about, and some shit that we said 10 years ago on the podcast in fucking 2011, 2012, that's going to get one of my friends canceled just because we were joking about fucking salt or something. And, 5 years from now, salt is going to be the new N-word or whatever the fuck. And to that, I say, fuck that. Don't give in to that type of shit, because the act of removing your podcast would be giving into that type of shit. And that is so antithetical to who you are, Mr. Ari Shaffir, and who you have been and how you've moved to date. So just know that your true fans will always have your back, which was essentially the point all along, right? At least I like to think so. Plus, selfishly, I don't want to have to scour the internet to find old hidden episodes of Ari Shaffir's Skeptic Tank. But yeah, man, if you guys haven't checked it out, definitely do. Ari Shaffir Skeptic Tank, the end of an era. Still can't fucking believe it, but thank you, Ari, and all the folks that helped put together, edit, promote, post Ari Shaffir's Skeptic Tank, and absolutely to each and every one of the guests that have been on it in the past. Shout out to Ari Shaffir Skeptic Tank. I will link to it in the episode notes for folks to check out.